Time and date is 2042, December 15th, 1948. Operation Paperclip initial candidacy interview for Dr. RUDOLF WERNICKE. Dr. WERNICKE, are you aware of what the CIA is doing in Munich?
I've heard enough.
And why you might be a special interest to the United States?
I assume you've heard enough.
It's well documented, but frankly, I must admit I didn't believe what I was reading. The way your work is described, it sounds like fairy tales.
10,000 years ago, our ancestors looked at the sun and deemed it a god.
Could you elaborate on these findings in more concrete terms?
What you've read is as concrete as I could make it. It was good enough for Turing, good enough for the Führer.
Which brings me to my second qualification. We want to ensure these candidates will remain loyal to the United States, or rather, not show any inclinations towards the German cause.
You don't understand what I've accomplished here, do you? These discoveries transcend the bounds of the fatherland, of nations, and loyalties of mankind itself.
What do you mean?
For millennia we strained to reach the Himmel and convene with a god, and for all that time we overlooked the one place divinity could be found.
Which is...
inward.
In the previous video, we examined the entirety of Temple Gate's factions, philosophies, and conspiracies in full. But so far, our foray into the Outlast universe has kept us within the confines of that apocalyptic cult town in the desert. Until now. Both the content and tone are going to change for this video. The previous entries were analytical, academic even, but here is where the greater world expands. Here is where we begin probing into what Outlast as a whole is trying to tell us. You might even consider this video the Outlast game theory that was never made.
How do you feel about the coming of our Lord Knopf?
Buckle in, folks. Things are about to get weird. One of Outlast 2's biggest revelations comes at the lakeside, where Blake witnesses a mysterious collection of metal towers emitting a blinding white light, the source of the dreams that walk outside of sleep. Exploring the shoreline deeper, he comes across a document written by an unnamed researcher that confirms his true nature. The towers are microwave emitters, inducing insanity in all those exposed to them. The efficacy of a game containing a significant chunk of lore in a single, easy-to-miss document aside, it's a damning discovery, one that ties the notorious Murkoff Corporation to Temple Gate. The town and its doomed population were nothing more than a cruel experiment in mind control and psychological warfare, and the unfortunate Langermans found themselves trapped at the mercy of the light. With the radio tower's destruction at the end of the game, it would seem we can close the book on Temple Gate and Murkoff's mysterious light. Their story is over. Our first clue that there's more to the madness that meets the eye is the nebulous nature of Lynn's child. While it's up to interpretation what Blake and Noth actually saw in the newborn baby, the fact remains that Lynn's pregnancy, where she underwent 3 trimesters in the span of, 10 hours? Was, in fact, real. Not only is phantom pregnancy a real-world condition, but it's one we've seen in the Outlast universe before. In issue 2 of the Murkoff account, it is revealed that 1 in 3 women who worked at Mount Massive Asylum developed phantom pregnancies from exposure to their experiments. A document in Outlast Whistleblower confirms that morphogenic engine technology induced phantom pregnancies by aggravating women's immune systems, adding that there is also prodigious morphogenic engine activity in the women's bone marrow. The appearance of the same affliction across 2 different mediums proves that the technology used in the radio tower's microwaves is the same as the technology used in the morphogenic engine. That's one connection, but let's turn our attention back to the researcher's note. It describes how the microwave signal strength seems to increase the further he travels from the towers. He theorizes that this could be microwave parallax, whatever the hell that is, or that the microwaves are triggering a feedback loop among the subjects, their belief and discomfort turning them into projectors. In other words, the Temple Gate denizens themselves have become individual microwave emitters, amplifying their collective insanity by mere proximity with each other. Medical proof of this comes in issue 5 of the Murkoff account, where former Temple Gate member Annalie's brain scans reveal an anomaly, lesions induced by microwave exposure. Considering that Anna Lee was only 15 at this time, it can be assumed that everyone in Templegate harbored similar lesions: the Testament, the Scald, and the Heretics. We saw something similar in prior games. Dr. Rudolf Wernicke's 1985 exit interview reveals that morphogenic engine patients from as far back as 1943 exhibited spontaneous bleeding and brain tumors made out of lead. Although the engine's actual technology is debatable at best, we can assume that radiation in the form of microwaves is involved, a process that directs radioactive particles into patients' flesh, manipulating their bodies at a genetic and molecular level to the point of what's basically alchemy. Many of the deformities we see on the variants in Mount Massive Asylum are a direct result of this therapy, from simple rashes to outright mutations. But despite the name, the variants' uniting commonality was the brain tumors. Which means that in afflicted subjects, from the variants to the Testament, the brain tumors induced by morphogenic engine technology are the sources of their own radioactive transmittance. And I'm certain that if we autopsied Lynn, or dug around Blake's skull, or even cut open Wayland Park's brain, we would find fresh tumors blooming there too. But this phenomenon goes further than cancer or insanity. Consider Billy Hope's patient status report, where he inquires about his mother's lawsuit against Murkoff, which the documenter insists is the result of a catastrophic security breach, despite Hope's claims that he saw the truth in the blood dreams of Dr. Traeger. Or a pamphlet regarding psychopathologist proximity stress disorder, supposedly a condition where doctors, in the extended presence of their patients, would start sharing their delusions. Notably, this is not a formally recognized medical condition. Or an email detailing how a security guard nowhere near the morphogenic engine or its patients spontaneously began speaking of the Walrider. Billings, the sender, tentatively describes the incursion as an airborne belief. It would seem that not even direct exposure to morphogenic engine technology is required to plant the seeds of contamination. If we think back to the Testament projecting insanity onto each other by mere proximity, what else could one of these tumor-afflicted subjects be projecting? Thoughts? Ideas? Even more tumors? Could it be that everyone at Mount Massive Asylum was harboring brain tumors of their own, originating from the morphogenic engine and its test subjects, spreading among and infecting the rest of the faculty like a virus, creating a network of interconnected radioactive projectors? And how much further could this communication system go? Is it possible that Eddie Gluskin's delirious proclamation that the whistleblower, Wayland Park, could put an end to Murkoff's corruption is actually a desperate call of support, having seen the email Wayland had sent out in his own blood dreams? And could it be that Wayland sending out that email in the first place is what finally compelled Billy Hope to achieve lateral ascension, conjure the Walrider, and wreak havoc on Mount Massive Asylum? A telepathic cult of microwave projectors, a population united by radioactive tumors, transmitting thoughts, beliefs, ideas, forming their own realities from the mind alone. Those who criticize the Outlast Trials for having no story simply miss the point. While players, called reagents, are unwilling participants in a series of brutal tests designed to break their spirits and condition them into obedience, the drama unfurling behind the scenes of the Sinyala Facility can be gathered by collecting evidence strewn throughout the levels. Also, it's a live service game whose official story has yet to be told, so be patient and let them cook. These documents provide not just a ton of context for the true nature of the trials, but how Murkoff-centric happenings link the other Outlast games. For starters, we learn that autopsied reagents subjected to the Sinyala Facility's therapy also spontaneously developed lesions within their brains. In later test subjects, these tumors propagate so heavily that their brains are damaged beyond repair. It is remarked that they are more tumor than gray matter.
There's almost as much tumor in this scan as gray matter.
Program director Hendrik Joliet Easterman refers to them as the cortical homunculus, what he deems a literal and metaphorical dark spot in the brain, which allows users to implant and alter preferred behaviors within a subject. However, it is likely that he's lying about this, and/or is misunderstanding their true nature. We also learn another commonality among the reagents, reported sightings of the so-called Skinner Man, an entity described as a Jungian nightmare man zeitgeisting his way through their collective subconscious, but we'll touch more on this later. We learn that Sullivan Noth was a reagent in the trials. Number 1616, released in July of 1959 in Fort Worth, Texas, eventually making his way to Albuquerque, New Mexico. His surveyor, Clyde Perry, occasionally activates him with trigger words, in one instance compelling him to murder a prostitute. and his behavior of placing metal objects to his face and orienting himself to Temple Gate's eventual coordinates are almost certainly a side effect of the tumors in his brain. We discover that fully conditioned reagents, molded into the perfect sleeper agents, complete their therapy by running across a lake towards a blinding white light, accompanied by a horribly familiar sound. Which tells us that not only were the Temple Gate microwave emitters derived from Sinyala Facility technology, but considering Perry's observation that Noth's coordinates fall within 40 miles of the Sinyala Facility, the two facilities are one and the same. And finally, most damning of all, is the identity of the trigger words used to activate subjects.
Spider. Lamb.
Until the Outlast Trials, we assumed that the Gospel of Noth was entirely a product of a rambling fanatic trying to imitate biblical prose. But the Outlast Trials' big reveal, combined with Noth's account of hearing the voice of God through radio static in Chapter 3, suggests something much more insidious. Murkoff was feeding the Gospel to Sullivan Noth. We already knew that Murkoff saw Temple Gate as an example of transmitting mind control and mass capitulation via religion, but now it's clear that Temple Gate was Murkoff's idea the whole time. How likely is it the abandoned mines on the outskirts of Temple Gate actually provided raw materials for the Sinyala Facility? How likely is it that the STD propagated by Noth originated in the Sinyala Facility, which features enemies canonically riddled with a weaponized variant of syphilis? How likely is it that Murkoff hurriedly fed the gospel of the Scald Christ to Laird Byron when they suspected he was straying too far? And how likely is it that Murkoff orchestrated Temple Gate's apocalypse? Did they plant heretical fantasies in Deacon Val's mind? Were they responsible for exacerbating the syphilis outbreak, as referenced in Noth's visions of the plague growing worse? Did their signals unknowingly work in tandem with Blake's arrival, whose perception of being the Antichrist's father amplify the Testament's projections of doom and destruction, a corrupted network of radio signals manifesting all the signs of the apocalypse, as referenced in Chapter 12? And finally, why would Murkoff bring about Temple Gate's downfall now, after decades of monitoring and experimentation? Again, we'll touch on that later, but for now, let's turn our attention back to the Skinner Man. Upon its reveal, many fans speculated that the Skinner Man was a prototype for the Walrider, a sort of rough draft for its ultimate form. And they're right. Kind of. Sort of. Maybe not. Let me explain. Unlike the Walrider, the Skinner Man is not a physical entity, but a collective hallucination witnessed by reagents tripping on aerosolized LSD. To them, it superficially resembles Dr. Easterman, who already casts himself as a godlike figure in order to better instill the therapy. Extended contact with the Skinner Man induces paralyzing fear within victims, resulting in heart attacks, strokes, and eventually, death. Throughout the documents, Easterman conveys a dismissive attitude towards the Skinner Man, claiming that his reported sightings are not science, and rebuffing any suggestions that he himself is reflected upon it. Yet this perception could not be more different than Dr. RUDOLF WERNICKE's, who, far from involving himself in sleeper agent hijinks, instead focuses on the reagent's dreams, insisting that any Skinner Man research be diverted his way, and remarking that Dr. Easterman might have made the most fruitful mistake in modern science since the discovery of penicillin. It's clear that Wernicke's fixation on this entity was the precursor for his dream therapy conducted in Mount Massive Asylum decades later, where lucid dreaming patients could manufacture nanoparticles on the cellular level, nanoparticles that would take on the physical form of the Walrider. But this doesn't make the Skinner Man a proto-Walrider. This would imply that the Walrider is the final product of a process, and that the Skinner Man was merely a stepping stone to achieve that end. This is not the case. Remember that Skinner Man sightings among the reagents are correlated with the appearance of lesions and tumors within their brains, or as Easterman calls it, the cortical homunculus. Could it be that the Skinner Man isn't merely a hallucination, but rather a psychic entity, confined to a network of brain tumors induced by Murkoff's therapies, a combination of drugs and alchemical microwave radiation, confirmed to be the same technology used in the Temple Gate radio towers and Mount Massive's morphogenic engine? Could the Skinner Man be passed among this telepathic cult of tumor-ridden patients, just as blood dreams, thoughts, and beliefs have been? We see a similar image every time reagents strap into the shuttle and breathe in the aerosolized LSD. Imagery of the atrocities latent in each trial, tinted blood red, festering with tendrils, even in reagents loading into a trial for the first time. Under the influence of LSD, our tumor-ridden reagents are seeing the Skinner Man in blood dreams. In short, the Skinner Man lives in the projections of alchemical tumors induced by Murkoff's therapies. But this doesn't explain where the Skinner Man came from in the first place. For that, We'll have to go back further. In 1954, before joining the Sinyala Facility, Dr. Easterman was in Hong Kong, studying American soldiers subjected to North Korean brainwashing. It is implied his studies are going nowhere. He contrasts his patients with those under Chinese Communist Party brainwashing. Whereas the Chinese populace are programmed machines, the American soldiers he likens to broken children. Not exactly a benchmark for ideological remodeling. February 11th, 1954. Easterman transcribes his patient Private Ramos's lucid ramblings of an invisible specter dubbed the Doctor, or Dr. Skinner, one that eventually scares the soldier into a permanent catatonic state. Considering the unlikely nature of these brainwashing victims, along with the suspicious nature of the death of Easterman's brother, Stanley Easterman, initially written off as a suicide, plus Dr. Jun Kusumura's assertions about the lies from Korea, it's probable that Murkoff was behind the alleged North Korean brainwashing as well, bringing the Skinner Man along with them. But this still isn't the Skinner Man's first appearance. Berlin, September 6, 1938. An unknown Nazi scientist reports a breakthrough with Dr. Wernicke's early morphogenic engine technology, the brief yet solid appearance of an apparition. Until now, we had long assumed this apparition to be the Walrider, but it would seem that Dr. Wernicke had summoned the Skinner Man as early as 1938. Yet this doesn't explain the Skinner Man's true origin. Before 1938, however, the image becomes cloudy, but maybe a hint can be found in one of the variant's dialogues.
They weren't experiments. They were rituals. A conjuring.
Far from a ghost or a demon, with all the shady practices and evil wrought upon the world by the Murkoff Corporation throughout history, and with talk of Carl Jung and dark spots in the human subconscious, could Rudolf Wernicke have conjured an entity molded purely from nightmares and depravity during one of the most nightmarish and depraved periods in world history, one contained to the shadowy psyche of the collective subconscious, fueled by mankind's worst instincts, and communicable with a vector such as radio waves or nanobots, driven to find a host, breaking free from the confines of the collective subconscious, the lesions and tumors its fingerprints in the brains of traumatized victims, and women's phantom pregnancies its vain attempts to conceive within a womb. The Walrider wasn't the end result of the Skinner Man. It was an expression, its physical body incarnate in the world, the Son and the unholy Trinity. Circling back to Outlast 2, what does this mean for the unfortunate cult town? Well, simply put, the god of Temple Gate was the Skinner Man, lying nascent in microwaves, transmitted directly into the subject's brains via the radio towers. Consider the vision Noth saw in Chapter 5, a humanoid entity with numerous phalluses and wings, before turning into Ezekiel's tetramorph, the Skinner Man's true form, accidentally revealing a fleeting glimpse, or the entity encountered by Testament cultists in their dreams, or the locusts that delivered Blake to the Skald, fulfilling the gospel of the Skald Christ. The Walrider, its incarnate form, possessing a swarm of insects, which it had already done with a colony of ants. Or the heretic's depiction of Lucifer, a massive humanoid with tendrils emerging from its head. Or, most conclusive of all, Blake's flashbacks, wrought with imagery of tentacles, pulsating veins, and a grotesque entity manifesting as a traumatic figure in his past, as it had reflected Hendrik Joliet Easterman decades prior. As for why Murkoff decided to induce Temple Gate's apocalypse, a hint can be found in 2 documents in Outlast Whistleblower. They discuss 3 mysterious patients, referred to as the Blind Dreamers, and profit potential with the recent breakthroughs involving them, enough to overshadow Dr. Wernicke's Project Walrider, which is described as a partial success, and incentivize his removal from Mount Massive's structural and financial systems. These blind dreamers require extreme levels of security and restraint, as close contact with them is very dangerous. Despite their disfigured faces, they are still, somehow, able to see, and they can apparently project hallucinations that recipients might mistake for communication. How they fit into Project Walrider, or Skinner Man research, or the rest of Murkoff's endeavors, is unknown. But if they're promising enough for Murkoff to want to pull the plug on Project Walrider and phase out Dr. Wernicke, then surely they'd erase all other evidence of Wernicke's involvement, including past projects, such as Temple Gate. It would appear these patients were successfully transferred to another facility, and the protocol for neutralizing Temple Gate was set in motion by 2013. But as for phasing out Dr. Wernicke and dissolving Project Walrider, it didn't quite happen the way they'd planned. Dr. Wernicke once said, "Nothing is supernatural." On its surface, this could be read as a dismissal of fairy tales of monsters and ghosts, with rational scientific explanations for all supernatural phenomena. But with everything concerning the Skinner man in mind, it could also be read as, these things are real, thus making what we took to be supernatural simply natural. The whistleblower's email that prompted Miles Upshur to visit Mount Massive Asylum mentioned something waiting for them in the mountain. Maybe it had been waiting for decades, or perhaps much longer, for as long as mankind's existence, brewing in the darkest depths of the human soul, waiting for someone to bring it forth.
Project Wallrider was a gateway to what?